So again, welcome everyone to the Fair Vote Canada webinar on proportional representation in Denmark, Ireland, and New Zealand. My name is Anita. I'm the Executive Director. If Fair Vote is new to you, if you're new to Fair Vote, we are a national nonprofit citizens campaign for proportional representation. So that just means that we think your vote should count. We think if a party gets about 30% of the vote, they should get about 30% of the seats, not 10% of the seats or 60% of the seats. Um, when you come in, you can say hello to other people who are watching in the chat. The chat is for you to talk with others who are also on the webinar. If you have questions for the panelists, please put your questions in the Q&A. So again, talking to each other is in the chat. Questions for our panelists are going to be in the question and answer box. And after our panelists each give about a 10-minute talk, then we will take as many of your questions for them as we can. And I'm going to turn this over now, mercifully, to Chris, who will take it from here and introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Nita. I'm calling in from Toronto, so I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. Fair Vote Canada, of course, we have volunteers, and we're working all across this country. But Toronto is on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. And I acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists tonight. Um, the first panelist I will introduce is Heino. Heino Doessing was born and raised in Denmark, where he was fully immersed in politics. He served as a city councillor in Solrød from 2006 to 2008 with Vestre, Denmark's Liberal Party, and later joined the Liberal Alliance and Fremad. Um, Today, he's no longer affiliated with any Danish party. Since moving to Canada in 2010, Heino has made Hamilton, Ontario his home. Drawn to socially liberal and fiscally responsible values, he found his political fit with the grassroots of the Liberal Party, where he has been active since 2020. In Ontario's 2025 election, he proudly represented Hamilton East Stony Creek as a provincial candidate, earning 32% of the vote, the best Ontario Liberal showing in over 18 years. A familiar face around Hamilton, wearing his Fair Vote Canada jersey at Ticats games, Heino is a strong advocate for proportional representation and has been active with Fair Vote Canada since discovering us in 2022. His efforts include writing 2 op-eds in the Hamilton Spectator, championing a successful resolution at the 2023 Liberal Party of Canada Convention for a National Citizens' Assembly on Electoral Reform, and highlighting proportional representation in his 2025 campaign. Great to have you tonight, Heino. Next, we have Trisha Keyes-Bevan. She's a longtime advocate of proportional representation and has been involved at all levels of politics for decades. She grew up in Limerick, Ireland, and immigrated to Toronto in 1967. After the death of her husband in 1989, she moved with her 2 small children back to Limerick and spent the next 2 decades there before once again returning to Toronto in 2017, where she now lives with her daughter, son-in-law, and grandson. Trisha studied early childhood education at George Brown College before going on to set up and manage a childcare center at Yorkdale High School for teenage parents to give them the opportunity to continue their education. This was the first child care center of its kind in Ontario and became a model that was expanded in high schools across Toronto. In Ireland, she launched and ran a successful Irish language preschool and taught both early childhood education and politics to college students. She has a degree in European politics, history, and Spanish from the University of Limerick. She comes from a long line of politicians. Her grandfather, Michael Jane Keyes, was a member of parliament and 2-time mayor of Limerick City. Her uncle, Christopher Keyes, also served as mayor, and Trisha herself ran in the Limerick local elections in 1991. Over the last 40 years, Trisha has volunteered countless times as an activist and political organizer, and now volunteers with Fair Vote Canada. Welcome, Trisha. Great to have you. And last but certainly not least, we have Emerson Howitt. Emerson was born and raised in New Zealand, and Emerson experienced politics under proportional representation through New Zealand's mixed member, or MMP, proportional system. Casting his first votes there showed him how proportional representation gave voters more choice and created governments that better reflected the diversity of the population. In 2018, Emerson moved to Canada and made Toronto his home. Confronted with the stark contrast between proportional representation in New Zealand and Canada's winner-take-all first-past-the-post elections, he decided to get involved with Fair Vote Canada in 2019. Drawing on his background in journalism and communications, Emerson works on Fair Vote Canada's social media using storytelling and outreach to build public support for a fairer voting system. Thanks for being on the call tonight, Emerson.
Okay, so we are going to start with Heino, and I'm wondering if maybe the rest of us should turn our cameras off just so that everybody can focus on what Heino's saying, and then we'll come back after. Okay, go ahead, Heino.
Hey, thank you very much. Just checking if I'm off mute here. I am, hoping everyone can hear me. My name is Heino, and I've been seeing folks dialing in from all across Canada and many other places. I myself am here in Hamilton, Ontario, born and raised in Denmark, but I've also called Greenland, North Carolina, and Saskatchewan home. So anyone dialing in from any of those places, a special hello to y'all. Before I get started, I should just put out the disclaimer that today I'm not representing my party, my employer, or any other organization I'm affiliated with. I'm just here as Heino Doessing, very passionate about democracy and electoral systems. So now that we've set that straight, I want to thank Chris for the introduction. And as Chris mentioned, I have run for office in two different countries. I've run for elected office in Denmark under a proportional system, and I've run for office here in Canada under a first past the post system. And in the next 10 or so minutes, I'll share some of my experience and how they compare between the two countries and how that relates to the electoral system. And I'll bucket it in three different buckets. I'll talk about the nomination process. I'll talk about the actual election campaign. And at the end, I'll wrap up talking a little bit about the day-to-day politics after an election. Now, starting with the actual nomination process, I'll make an observation on where you get to run and who gets to run. And I'll start with where you get to run. And quite frankly, where you get to run is kind of an odd question, especially if you're in Denmark. Because when you're affiliated with a party in Denmark, there's always room on the list. The party decides how long the list is. So you just get on that list, put your best foot forward, hope you get a good placement on your party's list, but there you are, and off you go. Here in Canada, however, with first past the post, your party will only have one person representing your party in your area. And so if you're not that person who gets to be the candidate for your party, you get to run somewhere completely different, or or you don't get to run at all. And therefore, a lot of people, they give up before you even get to the nomination because they don't see a path forward to being that single person in their area, and it puts a lot of people out of contention. Now, me personally, I was lucky that I live in Hamilton and got to live in a Hamilton and run in a Hamilton riding, but it really impacts who ends up considering running. The fact that the chances of you getting to do it where you live are slimmer under first past the post. And now I want to focus a little bit more on who gets to run. So here in Canada, under first past the post, again, a single person gets to run in each area. And for a party, they know roughly what areas that they will win the safe seats, so-called safe seats, or where they're in contention. And there, they want their so-called star candidates. And that's typically a local lawyer, a local media personality. Maybe it's someone local who's already elected for office at a different level, and they are typically considered the star candidates that get to get those more attractive seats. And now that puts young candidates out of contention for those seats. They typically either get to run somewhere less attractive, or they don't get to run at all. Now, in Denmark, that is different. Again, the parties, they set the list, and there's always room on the list. So everywhere you always have some sort of young candidate somewhere on the list. And I'll use myself as an example. When I ran for office in Denmark, I was 20 years old. I was definitely the young candidate. Funny enough, 20 years later, I'm still considered the young candidate, but nonetheless, 20 years ago, I was definitely the young candidate, and I got the 11th spot on my party's list. Now, my party expected to get a maximum of 8 seats on council. They ended up winning 7 seats. However, because of my personal direct vote count, I jumped that list and got the third seat. So under such a system, it's the folks that actually have the ability to broaden the tent, go out and get new votes, that end up bubbling to the top. And that's a stark contrast to Canada, where you kind of already know what your parliament is going to look like and who's going to represent you before the campaign has even started. And that brings me to the campaign. Now, I've talked about the nomination process, and talking about the actual election campaign, I'll focus on the experience of a candidate as a part of a team with fellow party members. I'll focus a little bit after that on the relationship with your political opponents and your interactions with voters. Now, starting with the team, when I ran in Denmark, we were 15 on my list. So right off the bat, my party had, in my area, had a team of 15 candidates, plus their family, plus their closest friends. So right from the get-go, you had a very broad team of people who could help carry the load of fundraising and some of all the other stuff you don't want to be bogged down with as a candidate. So as a result, that just made it much more of a pleasure right off the bat and less stressful to run as a candidate under that kind of system versus the system here where you're the only person and everything is on your shoulders. Now, when we then talk about the relationship with folks from the other parties, I'd say the election campaign is generally, based on my experience, less divisive. There's less mudslinging in the Danish election versus what I've experienced here in Canada. And it's due to the fact that here in Canada, you have one person from each party on the bill, meaning that it is very efficient to try to win an election by just tearing down that other person from that other party in the hopes that that person's voters will stay at home or come across the middle. That's more efficient than actually going out and doing the hard work of getting more folks to the ballot box. And that just makes for less divisive politics. And I don't want to say that there's no mudslinging in Danish politics. There certainly is, but it just is less intensely personal. And that boils down to the mere fact that if folks want to go after your party, in my case, they had to go after 15 people, right? And if they wanted to go after a coalition of parties, they will have to target, I don't know, up to 50 different people. And in that kind of setup, it just becomes much more efficient to focus on what you yourself is about and run on that. And that just creates a much less divisive and a much more positive experience as a candidate running for office. And that brings me to the last bucket I want to bring up when it comes to an election campaign, and that is the meeting with the voters. Now, in Canada, under first past the post, we know that there's just a number of seats. There are the so-called safe seats where voting feels like it doesn't matter. And as I just alluded to, there's quite a lot of mudslinging. It's less about policy, it's more about tearing each other down. So so as a result, when you meet voters at the door, there's just more apathy here. People seem checked out. Voting doesn't matter, and they're just about a bunch of mudslingers, those politicians. And as a result, we see folks, for instance, here in Ontario, the provincial election, what did we have? Like 40% showed up to vote. And contrasting that to Denmark, where there's less apathy, where voting does seem to matter, we routinely see voter percentage north of 80%. Getting south of 80%, that's a shockingly bad turnout in Danish standards. So you really see the difference. And also as a candidate, you just feel a different level of energy when you do interact with voters during a campaign. So now, having talked about your running in a campaign, your team members, your political opponents, and meeting with voters, I'll address what politics look like beyond election day, the day-to-day politics. And I'll highlight two observations here. And that is that I find that politics under a proportional system is less divisive and more efficient. About the point of being less divisive, kind of ties in with what I've already talked about, but another component of making the politics under a proportional system less divisive is that you typically get minority governments or you get coalition governments. And on any given issue, you may need help from different parties across the spectrum. So you have to have the ability to sit in a room and have a sober conversation with everyone. Said in a different way, you have to be friends with everyone. And that just creates less divisive politics. And as a fun fact, when it comes to some of the big decisions that really shape what the society looks like in Denmark, you typically get most of the parties they do find each other, and you really see on those bigger things, it's not just 50% plus one that votes for. It's typically a broader coalition of parties that get together on those big items that really shape what Danish society will end up looking like. And now that ties well into my point about politics in a proportional system being more efficient. More efficient mean better bang for your buck as a taxpayer. And as I mentioned, that ties in with this fact that on the big decisions, there's just a whole bigger coalition of parties that have been in on putting getting those policies through. Meaning, when we have a change of government, those big important decisions, they have some staying power. You don't see in Denmark the same kind of policy lurch that you see here, where the mandate of a new government here in Canada seems to be to tear everything apart the other folks have done, regardless of whether it's good policy, just because the others did it. And that's extreme policy lurch that is very inefficient. That's one point in how a proportional system is more efficient, according to my experience. The other aspect that makes a proportional system more efficient is that we don't see the non-stop by-elections. I mean, we just had a federal election in April here in Canada, right? And we've already had the first by-election, and we all hear about the rumors about all the by-elections that are just around the corner. So the taxpayers constantly have to foot the bill for new by-elections, whereas under the system in Denmark, when someone steps down from their seat, you get the alternate from the party. They come in and take over, and on you go with things. You don't hit pause and do a whole new campaign. And for the mere reason that they Danish parties are not in non-stop election mode, you get a situation where there's extended periods of time where the weekly polls don't matter. The government can actually get down to the business of governing and take the big decisions that may initially be unpopular, but have some staying power and create some good down the road. And that is just much more efficient politics when you're not always in election mode like we see here under first past the post. And on that note, I've talked about the experience as a candidate under the different systems, come nomination, come election campaign, and after. And I just want to wrap up and say that no system is perfect, but I do, not even the Danish, I do think, however, we can learn a lot here in Canada from how politics is done in Denmark, including the electoral system. And if by saying what I've said, I've scared anyone from ever running in a Canadian election, I just want to say that I ran and I plan to run again. So it's not all bad. And if there's anyone out there who ever wants to talk to anyone about them considering running and wants some feedback on what that looks like, reach out to me at Hamilton Heino on Instagram, or give your contact details to Anita and she can forward them to me. I'm happy to always talk to anyone. Now, on that note, I'll be quiet for now and look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Heino. That was great. It's always really good to talk to Heino because he reminds me like campaigning can actually be fun. It sounds like it's a lot more inclusive, fun, supportive, welcoming, and rewarding in the long term under a proportional system. So thank you so much. And now we have Trisha. And Trisha, as you heard, is from Ireland. And Trisha and I have had lots of chats about Irish politics, which I've really enjoyed because there's not too many people that want to chat about Irish politics. So I'm really happy to have Trisha here and talk about how proportional representation makes a difference in Ireland.
Oh, Anita, I would talk 24/7 with you about Irish politics because they are absolutely fascinating. As Anita said, my name is Trisha Keyes-Bevan. And first of all, I would like to welcome some of my Irish friends who will be tuning in. So I will say Foilta, Quigon webinar, and also my son Declan, who is living in Brisbane, Australia, and who has he's also very interested in politics. He works with his local Labour Party, like myself. Ireland has had the PR, the proportional representation system, for the last 100 years. Now, I will come back later to stability, and because, as Heino has said, there is often a lot of instability with coalition partners, and also there's that fear that you're going to get all the sort of weirdos and, out there kind of parties. But in Ireland, that hasn't happened, and I will go through it later. Now, what I decided to do to compare between voting in Ireland and voting in Canada, I decided to compare my own riding here in Davenport, which is Davenport riding, and my own constituency in Limerick. Now, just to give a bit of context, the population of Limerick City is 103,000 approximately, and there are 78,000 voters voted in the last election, which was the general election last year. Now, there are 4 seats, 4 deputies can be elected. This year, this time, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin and Labour won a seat. Now, if you compare that to Davenport, that would have been, that could have been Liberal, Conservative, NDP and Green. Just sort of keep that in mind. Now, there were 14 candidates in the election in Limerick. Compare that again, and Heino mentioned the same about the limit in the numbers of people who can actually run. The difference in the two systems, as Anita said, I could talk forever about Irish politics. Well, I love politics, but I particularly love Irish politics. With the STV, the single transferable vote, and the fact that you have 3 or 4 members in your constituency, there's a lot of competition, and what they tend to do, and that seems to be kind of the way it goes in Ireland, is they spend a lot of time focusing on their local constituency. And obviously the reason for that is because they could have they have their own colleagues, and they have to make sure they're looked after so that people will vote for them the next time. Now, what happens with that system in Ireland, you have to go to all the funerals, you have to go to the graduation, the baptisms, well, depending on the family, not so much. But if you're not seen at those, then you're going to be put in the bad books. And so it's very much local, and the national level legislation is not really as much of a focus. Now, the other thing as well is I'm going to call them TDs, Tuachta Dálaí, because that's the Irish word for MPs, and it just comes to me more easily. They have a clinic in their constituency office, usually every week, and people will come in, and they're trying to get, they're on the housing list, and they want to try and get their moved up a bit so they won't be waiting as long. They're trying to get a medical card, which is because we have private healthcare. Anita asked me to mention when I ran in the local elections, there's a particular local school that I have to say my own children went to, a Jesuit school, but we lived in the area. And I said to this woman, will you give me your vote? And she said, yeah, I will, if you can get my children into the comp. The other thing as well is, that most of the people that are running, and in Ireland, I love election campaigns. I love canvassing. There's lots of banter because you're voting down the whole ticket of 14 or 15, and people will say, oh yeah, I won't give you the number 1, but I'll give you the number 2. And that's the advantage, because if you have such a range of politicians representing you, and as I mentioned, if you compare them with Liberal, Conservative, NDP and Green, they all have different interests. And so it's important to, the transfers are critical. I would say there's a friendly rivalry with the elections. In Ireland, we still count all the votes by hand, and it's on the count day. It's absolutely fantastic because everybody's invited in, and they open the ballots, and you can see. And usually, you'll have tally people from each party, and they'll be counting 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, because you have to get as many votes at the top of the ticket. I know it's kind of difficult, but and made it as easy as that. And then whenever you're elected, they hoist you up on their shoulders, and doesn't matter man, woman, or child. And it's just brilliant. I mean, it's a great day. Now that's what I'm going to say about my own constituency in Limerick, and I will come back to it because I have a couple of points. Now, Downport riding, where I'm living now, and those of you who live in Toronto, you know it's a city riding. It has a population of 125,000, and there are 94,000 registered to vote. Now, as Heino mentioned, with first past the post, one member is elected, winner takes all. Now, this year there were 5 people on the ballot. So if they had PR here in this riding, 4 of the 5 would have been elected. So think of it like that. In my experience here, in the 10 years I've been living here, there's scant local contact. All the emphasis is on Parliament. I have been in this riding for 10 years, and Julie Derowitz, MP Derowitz, she got elected just around the time I moved here. The seat was originally an NDP. She has never in the 10 years knocked at my door. I have never had people in between elections coming to canvass. The other parties, they do that. Also, I get, when the elections are called, I usually get a robocall. I mean, and then I get, the 3 or 4 mails from her government mails, and just kind of telling us, and she's all the pictures of all the events she was at, making sure that she's traveling around, but she has not knocked on my door. I want to share again another episode that happened since I joined Fair Vote, and especially after the last election. Anita had suggested that we go and visit different MPs to see kind of who's interested, who's not interested. And I said, yeah, in Davenport, I'll do that. And got a group of 3 or 4 Fair Vote members. And so I was at one of the street, Big on Bloor, and I specifically went to where Julie was with her team, and I talked to her in person because I knew I'd get, can I say, the bum's rush if I phoned her office. And oh yeah, she said yes, definitely. And her assistant took my details, and we'll be in touch. August would be a good time because it's quiet before the Parliament starts again. August came and went, not a word. I phoned her office, and oh yes. So they sent out all the details, make sure I lived in Davenport and the whole thing, sent it all off. And 3 weeks later, I got a phone call from her minder, or however you call them, her administrative staff. I shouldn't be so. And she said, well, MP is not available to visit, but said she could have a quick phone call with you and go through what she'd like to go through, what I'd like to go through. And I said, no, thank you. I got back to Anita, and you can imagine, I was so disheartened by the whole thing, because as I was sharing earlier, in Ireland, your MPs are so accessible. And I'm going to share a story now before I finish up about one of our MPs in Limerick. And so Anita said, send off an email and say, look, we can meet her whenever she's available, whatever time. You can bring 3 or 4 people and we'll suit her. I have not heard a word. I've been concentrating on getting ready for this and other things. So we'll go again. On the opposite side, in Ireland, a friend of mine recently had surgery, and the election was last year, and the local Labour TD who won the seat, absolutely fantastic win, and he's quite young, but he's fantastic. And he hadn't his local office open, so I emailed him. I know him from when I was in Ireland. So I said, Connor, his name is Connor Sheehan, Labour, just in case anybody hears about him. And I said, my friend, she's just had surgery, and what's your address of your constituency office? Because she just wants to have a visit to see long-term what health, what's available, benefits, etc. And he said, give me her number. He said, you know what? I can go to her house and visit her because, she's just had surgery. I'll do that. And within a day or two, he was in contact. She went into the office. He brought the papers, or he sent them. All done, all gone off to the Department of Health and Social Protection. So that's the difference. I'm in Canada and I got a faster answer from Limerick than I can get from Bloor Street from MP Derovich. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you, Trisha. I like those stories because they provide like a practical, real life example of the contrast, especially when we hear from so many MPs, that, oh, we can't have PR because we'd lose our local representation. And now you're hearing from someone that actually you might get better local representation with a proportional system. Thank you, Trisha. And I'm going to introduce Emerson here. And I now work with Emerson. So for those of you who don't know, Emerson has our social media. And thanks to those of you who so generously donated to the fundraiser I put out in September, we've been able to keep him on doing our social media on a permanent basis. And I'm so glad that he's joined our team and has the experience from New Zealand that he can use to tell us how things are there compared to how they are here. So I'll turn it over to you, Emerson.
Oh, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Emerson Howitt. I've been involved with Fair Vote since 2019, and I currently do most of Fair Vote Canada's social media. So, if you have seen anything on our socials across our 8 or so different platforms I post on now, then it's probably been done by me. So many people ask me, like, Emerson, you're from New Zealand, you've only been in Canada for, less than a decade. Why is this something you're so passionate about? And it's funny, really, because when I first moved to Canada, electoral systems weren't really something I thought about a lot. I was one when New Zealand had its first MMP election, and that was just the system I grew up in and voted in. And it always just seemed to make sense. You vote, and how you vote, you either vote for your local candidate, or sorry, it's you have 2 votes, so you vote for your local candidate and then you vote for a party as well. And it just seemed to make sense. And then when I moved to Canada in 2018, I saw my first election that I experienced was the Ontario 2018 election, where Doug Ford came to power and has been Premier of Ontario since. And I just thought the results didn't make any sense to me. I was looking at them and I was going, how does he have a majority when he only won 40% of the vote? And that's when I sort of went down this rabbit hole of learning about electoral reform in Canada and how close we've come, and sadly, like how much we've missed. But it really got me wanting to get involved more and share my experience from New Zealand, and also help wherever I can. Uh, so, so to talk about how MMP works in New Zealand, I think we have to first talk about the history of how New Zealand led towards New Zealand implementing MMP. So New Zealand had its first MMP election in 1996. Before that, it was first past the post. There was a referendum held in 1993 to confirm MMP, and there was a referendum held before that that had a multiple different systems and people, and that one chose MMP as well. And so the and so leading up to that, what happened was New Zealand was a two-party system, very entrenched two-party system. You either had the National or Labour, and National were the Conservative or right-wing party, and Labour were the left, and it really just bounced between them for most of the last century. And this led to some incredibly distorted and dramatic policy swings. Labour would get in power and implement a bunch of stuff, and then the next election they would lose, and then National would rip it all down, and then Labour would come back in and change a bunch of things, and it just really wasn't working for a lot of people. Minor parties weren't getting elected. Some parties were getting up to 20% of the vote and not winning even a seat or maybe just one seat. And so it really felt like a lot of people were being excluded. The governments weren't making decisions that were representative of what a lot of people wanted, and people were really looking for change. And this really came to a head in the late 70s when New Zealand had two wrong winner elections. So the national government at the time won two elections in a row where they came second in popular vote, but they still won a majority. And this also marked a time when New Zealand went under a major period of economic stagnation. There was very high interest, there was very high inflation, marked by low wage growth. And so a lot of people were very unhappy, and they were like, this government is not representative of us, and it's also it seems to be making a lot of bad decisions with the economy. And then Labour finally got into power in 1984, and then they immediately went ahead with some major economic free market reforms, which really hurt a lot of industries in New Zealand. New Zealand had a quite protected economy, and so from a lot of people's perspective, we had this policy lurch from this government that didn't reflect us at all, and then this other government that still had a majority with less than 40% of the vote, then going in the complete opposite direction. And so by then, people were very upset. They wanted change. And so the government, to placate them, went ahead with a royal commission. And that royal commission looked at a whole bunch of different systems and ultimately decided on MMP, mixed member proportional. And they decided on that ultimately because they felt it offered the best of both worlds. You still voted for a local representative and then you voted for the party as well. So you could still have that local representation, but you also made sure that the overall makeup of Parliament was more reflective of how people actually voted. And so after that, the pressure just kept mounting until finally a referendum was agreed to be held, and New Zealand went ahead with MMP. And since then, there really hasn't been a major push to change. There was a referendum held in 2011 that decided to keep MMP, and that failed. They voted to keep it, and so yeah, so that's how MMP got implemented. So how MMP works in New Zealand specifically. So you have 72 MPs who represent an electorate or a riding. We don't call them ridings in New Zealand, but it's the same thing. So 72 MPs are elected through that, and then 48 MPs are elected off a party list. And the way a party list is chosen by the parties. Different parties have different ways of deciding who goes on the party list. Some parties, like the Green Party, they have an open convention where all the members can vote on who goes on the list, and other parties have a selection committee where the list is chosen by kind of a representation of like the party's base, the party's membership. And so those are the two main ways that they're chosen. And what we find from the party list is that parties tend to try and prioritize having people high on the list that represent a good representation of the country. So if Labour know they don't win a lot of the electorate seats in rural areas, so they can make sure they have more rural MPs on their list and that they can still get in. Likewise, National can make sure that they have more from urban areas where they might not win as many seats. They can still make sure that those people are on the list as well, and so they can still get elected, and you can still have representation from those areas even if you don't win any electorate seats. Same with other minority groups. Māori, Pacific Island communities. You can make sure that they're very well represented on the list if they might not necessarily win as many of the electorate seats. And so this really creates a situation where parties are way more representative of people as a whole, as opposed to just the handful of ridings that they tend to win. And so what this means is no party wins a majority unless they win over 50% of the vote. The only time that's happened was once in 2020 when Jacinda Ardern won a majority at the time, the first time that had ever happened in the MMP era. And so she was able to govern during her term just as one party. But before that, and since 2003, it's always been a multi-party coalition. And there's been a bunch of different ways that those are agreed to. So sometimes they will go into direct coalition. So they will be in cabinet, parties will be in cabinet together, they'll make decisions. And other times it'll be some parties will just offer confidence and supply. So they will say, okay, you forward these priorities we have, and then we will vote on matters of confidence. We will vote in favor of what you put forward. And there can also be other clauses. There are things like agree to disagree clauses, where if a party in a coalition doesn't agree to a policy that's being put forward, they can still vote no. And if the government and if the rest of the parties are able to find people across the aisle that can vote in favor, then they can get those people to vote. And so it's a clause that means that parties can still have disagreements within the coalition without having to bringing down the government. And this has also led to a very stable democracy in New Zealand. We have not had one early election since MMP was implemented. The 2002 election was held about 2 or 3 months early, but that's the closest we've come to a proper early election. And this is ultimately because the nature of MMP and the nature of proportional representation means that no matter even if you bring down a coalition, even if a new election is held, the most likely outcome is just going to be another minority government where people have to work together and form a coalition. So a lot of times so it really makes early elections feel pointless, especially when you know it's just going to result in the parties having to work together again. And so this means that parties tend to try and make what they have work. They try and boost and really highlight when they've got wins, so they can then go to voters and say, hey, when we were in the coalition, we were able to get this pushed forward, or get this other thing pushed forward. And if you support us more, then think what we can do next election. And so it's that kind of messaging. And if parties are seen as being unstable coalition partners, they're not seen as being helpful, then they can actually get punished in the polls. And we've seen this in New Zealand with a few parties who have they've been kicked out of parliament because they did not win enough of the party votes, or they did not win an electorate, and that's because they can be seen as sometimes as unstable or unhelpful. So that promotes parties to really work together and build stable coalitions. And it doesn't even need to be the party with the highest vote share. So in 2017, the Labour government formed a coalition with New Zealand First with a confidence and supply from the Greens, even though National technically won the most votes. But because those three parties were collectively still represented over 50% of the population, they had the ability to join forces, and their seats collectively were able to form a majority. And so it means that means that you can have parties that you don't need to worry about, which party has the most votes. Which part you can just vote for who you want to, and you can know that those votes contribute to the seat count, and those parties can still work together, even if the party in the coalition isn't the largest party, because it's all about who can represent a majority. It's not about just who has the most votes. And what this has led to a lot more policy stability. As I was saying earlier, New Zealand and National and Labour often tore each other's policies down. And since then, the change in policies between governments has been far more stable. It's far less likely that something's going to get ripped up or cancelled. It still does happen from time to time, but ultimately governments tend to more put their spin on an existing policy and try and tweak it a little bit, as opposed to just making big destabilizing changes. And this leads to local government. So in local government, councils have the ability to choose single transferable vote, just like in Ireland. So this is where you have multi-member wards, and people vote in those wards for their councillors, and then that can then contribute to the council overall being more representative proportionally. And then the mayor is normally chosen just through a ranked ballot. And then that then makes up the council. And so New Zealand's had that since 2004, and and certain councils have implemented it. It's up to the councils whether they want to implement it or not. But those councils tend to have higher voter turnout, and also councils that are just way more representative of New Zealand. And that actually came out of New Zealand having MMP, because it was the one of the minor parties, the Green Party, that pushed for the change to STV at the local government level. So it was because New Zealand had MMP that they were then able to push for STV at a later date. There are still a few ongoing debates in New Zealand. It is interesting because New Zealand is a kind of smaller, has not had MMP for as long as the other countries that we've discussed tonight, and so it's still considered in a lot of ways still like in the early stages. Even though we've had it for 30 years now, there's still a lot of ways that things are changing, things that can seem unexpected or not really but people are still learning and people are still developing the system. So the main ongoing debate is the 5% threshold, about whether it should be lowered or not, because 5% can be seen as a bit too high for some parties, and so there has been some recommendations to lower it as low as 4% and 3%. So what that threshold means is that if your party wins more than 5%, then they then get awarded seats in Parliament. Or if they win an electorate seat, then they get seats that way. So those are the two ways you win seats. And so that 5% threshold can be considered a little high for some parties, and so there's been some debate about whether that should be changed or not. And yeah, but besides that, MMP has been one of the best things that's happened to New Zealand. It's completely changed the way politics is done, and really has opened the doors for so many more reforms and things that have happened that have just made New Zealand a far better and more representative democracy. So I'll hand it back now, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Emerson. And can I get Heino and Trisha and Emerson? I'd like to get you all back on the screen here for some questions. There, awesome. Thank you, Emerson. I appreciate that. I just wanted to make a quick little note about what Emerson was saying about how in 2020, Jacinda Ardern had won a majority government in a proportional system. She actually did win a majority, and she also reached across the aisle and invited members of another party to be in her cabinet anyway, which was just sort of a testament to how much the political culture had changed in New Zealand from when PR came in, that cooperation between parties had become so normal that even when she really didn't need another party, she decided to have another party in her government anyway. So quite a big change. So we've got quite a lot of questions. Probably gonna have time for maybe 4 or 5 questions. I'm gonna start with one. Can everybody hear me? Can you guys hear me? I wanna make sure people can still hear me. Okay,
I can hear you.
awesome. Okay, getting through this cold here. One of the questions I had come in through Zoom was about having more parties. What difference does it make to politics to have more parties? I mean, so Canada, we're not a two-party system, but I mean, the last election, we became a lot closer to a two-party system thanks to first past the post, right? Whereas, yeah, I mean, that close, I know was saying, yeah, it's pretty scary actually. Whereas in Denmark, I would imagine they probably have about at least 10 or more parties in the parliament. In Ireland, probably 9 or 10 parties in the parliament. In New Zealand, usually is 5 or 6. It's gone as low as 4, but then it kind of bounces back up to 5. What difference does that make to politics to have more parties represented? How do you get things done? How do you navigate things? Does it make it unwieldy? Who can comment on that?
Well, I can start, and maybe I can just comment on it as a voter or someone running for office, and maybe someone else can fill in, some of the other aspects of having more parties. And you're right, in Denmark there is more than 10. I think right now there are 12 parties in parliament. And if I think back to when I first got into politics and looked into the parties, what comparing to my experience of finding a party that fits me better in Canada was that it was easier in Denmark. Like I knew I was a liberal. There are four liberal parties in Danish Parliament, so you could find the one that really suited your type of liberal kind of politics. Whereas now. The Liberal Party, but also the NDP and Conservative, it's quite a huge tent, right? And if it can have different flavors, and you can see yourself maybe siding with uh, 70% of what your preferred party stands for, because, well, it's the lesser of three evils kind of thing, right? Whereas it's easier to find a party when you have more to choose from that align with potentially 90% of what you stand for. So it's just easier to find something that you're truly passionate about and to get involved with. And I do think that's another reason why you see more than 80% vote, because there is just something to vote for that you really are down with and passionate about.
I know, Trisha, did you have a comment
Uh,
on parties, small
yes,
parties?
we have had coalition governments in Ireland for probably certainly since I was a child. There, we used to have majority, but Ireland has worked with coalition so well. I mean, the way it's done. I mean, we've for the longest time we had Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and then Labour. So you had the two big parties, a smaller party, but they negotiate. Whoever the biggest party, they negotiate with whatever. Like let's say it's Fianna Fáil, and they will invite Labour, and if Labour accepts. So everything is negotiated beforehand. And then, who's getting the seats, who's getting ministerial posts, and the program for government is also fully prepared, documented. Like, for instance, Labour, when they went, they wanted, because we didn't have contraception in Ireland for the longest time. So they said, we want that to be part of it. And then they're locked in. Now, recently, what's happened is we've had a lot more sort of lefty parties back. They're usually one or two or three. So there isn't, they have their place. What they've done sometimes is they've put together their own grouping, and that way then they will get financial, they'll get money from the parliament and that. We also have another very interesting situation where you'll have, let's say, members of parliament they weren't picked for the particular election, and they say, well, I'm not running with Fianna Fáil, I'll run as an independent. But when it comes to voting, they still kind of vote. You'll have single issue candidates, potholes. We've had people run for potholes. We've had people for hospitals. And that to me is the fascinating thing about a coalition government. And just the last point I want to make, which is a very important one, Sinn Féin, most of you who do or don't know about Irish history, they're the political wing of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, who did all the bombings and everything. And there was no way Southern Ireland, Northern Ireland were going to ever even speak to each other. We had the Good Friday Agreement, and then that meant that Sinn Féin could vote in the north and in the south. They are now actually the main opposition party in the Irish government. So they have won the largest, well, it's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are in the coalition, but they're the official opposition. So anything can work if you work at it.
And I
Thank
want to
you.
add another point. I think you, in your question, Anita, or in the question, there was implied that, oh, if you get a lot of parties, you get a lot of chaos. How do you rule? How do you herd all those cats? But another way to look at it, you have a richer debate. You get more
Absolutely.
varied voices rather than the politics we have here. They're kind of predictable, right? We kind of know what Carney at the Liberals Party stand for, and you automatically know that, well, the conservatives are going to disagree, right? Like, but there's so you get a debate with more nuance, with more parties, and I'd say again, like as I said in my initial bit, when it comes to the big decisions, and I'll compare it to when we did budgets when I was in council in Denmark. Like when it came to the budget, which was the biggest and most impactful decision we had to make throughout the year. 14 out of 15 voted for, 13 out of 15 voted for. Like so even though there's this rich debate, they managed to get together and find a way forward together on the items that really matter for the future of yeah, one's area.
Yeah, if I can just like back up what Heino's saying too. I mean, one of the most inspiring things was in 2020 when 9 out of the 10 parties in the Danish parliament had agreed on a climate law, which is like almost the strongest piece of climate legislation in the world. I mean, that included the conservative parties. So if
Yeah.
you think you can't get things done with all these parties, it's just not true. The countries with proportional representation on average are the ones that are getting things done, even though they have to negotiate and compromise to do it. Did you have any comments, Emerson, on um, working with different parties, more parties?
Yeah, I thought the comments here were great. Well, I'd say that what I've seen from New Zealand and versus what I've seen here in Canada is that you already see all these different factions in these big tent parties in Canada, and they often, and what happens with that is that all these debates end up happening behind closed doors where you can't see them, and so you don't really know which faction is really influencing what until the government announce what policy it is, and whereas in a proportional system, where one party isn't representing the entire left or right spectrum, you have more of that debate out in the open. You have more of that discussion, and you can really get a clearer idea of who exactly is pushing for what. And so you can know you can know, like, okay, so this party is not a party I really want to vote for because they seem to be pushing for this policy, and then versus other parties. And so it really creates this far more transparency, I think, in these debates when it's happening out in the open instead of behind some big tent party where you don't really know who's in control at any point.
Chris, are you still with us? I'm checking if Chris Mohan is still here with us.
Yeah, I'm here, ready to jump in.
Come on in, Chris. Can you pose a question to to the panelists?
Yeah, this was a question that was coming up quite a bit. And I think, Heino, the question is about local representation. And you had brought up that you were on a list, and then because of your popularity, despite the initial ranking, you were able to jump up on that list. I think without getting a little bit too into like the mechanics of it, how does that system still allow for local representation and for someone to have that representation?
Okay, yeah, and I'll use myself an example to answer that question. I will say, however, I think it also translates well to the situation on the national level. Despite, and again, we don't want to get into the weeds, but municipal is pure representative, pure proportional in Denmark, whereas it's a little different on the national level. But without getting into the weeds of that, I can, based on my experience. So as I mentioned, I was number 11 on the list of 15 people from my party, just in case we got 100% of the votes and got all 15 seats in city council. And I was able to jump to almost the top and get the third seat because of personal votes. And so when I ran, there weren't wards. It was one big ward per se, like the whole municipality. And when the party got together and we found candidates to put on the list, it was a clear consideration that we need to have a person from this village over here. We needed to have a person from this village over here to make sure that we would get votes from those villages. So in that sense, there were local representatives. And again, using myself as a very direct example, when I looked at what polling stations my personal votes actually came from, they were from the two polling stations local closest to my house. Because that's where the people, they knew I understood that the very local issues of, noise from the highway that didn't impact the other end of the city, right? So there again, it became uber local. And as the saying goes, all politics are local, and that certainly also applies under a proportional system.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Chris, that's a really good question. I think Trisha has something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention in terms of the local level, it's also proportional, but you voted on in your particular area, and that's the area that you cover. You don't, you run against whatever 3 or 4 candidates, and then once you're chosen, once you win, unlike the list system, and then once you won, you might have 14 or 15 other people, but once all the votes transfer, when you win, it's your seat and your area. So I think Limerick gets divided into, I think, maybe northeast, some north, south, east, and west. And then you sit on the council representing your area, and you're still allowed to have a party. It's not like here where we all know what they really are, but nobody says anything. What their color, their stripes are. Thank you.
So for anybody that's just sort of new to Fair Vote and coming in and going, whoa, what are they talking about now? They're getting into the weeds. Just to back up a little bit, the whole idea with proportional representation, no matter what system it is, you're electing more than one winner. That's what I want everybody to remember. When you have a winner take all system, you're only going to have one MP. So there's one MP representing your riding. Like Trisha gave us an example of spending 3 months now trying to get her MP's office to make an appointment with her. So imagine if there were 4 or 5 representatives of different parties that were also representing that same area, then you have a little bit of competition. Okay. And so it tends to increase the responsiveness of the MPs a little bit when there's a little bit of competition in the system. And it also gives every voter at least one MP where they feel like, okay, this person that represents me is really aligned with my political values. So that's what all these systems have in common, even though the system in Ireland, proportional ranked choice voting, in Denmark, a flexible list system, or in New Zealand, MMP, they're all slightly different versions of the same basic idea. Okay, so I have one more question I'll toss out here. Someone wrote into me about referendums. So she said, I understand referendums are part of the equation to get this change. I wonder what are all the options for approaching a decision to accept this new structure. Is a referendum the most successful or appropriate in our Canadian multicultural, racially diverse population? Is this a meaningful way to bring our population to awareness and togetherness? Basically, she's asking, do we have to have a referendum? And what do you think? Who would like to answer that?
I can start with that. I mean, New Zealand did a referendum to implement MMP, and I think it was, I'm glad that it passed. But I also think that referendums are something that can be easily gamed and manipulated. One of the things about the referendum when it passed in New Zealand was that it came off about a decade of parties behaving in a very unpopular way, and while at the same time not being representative of the people. And so at that point, people were just so fed up that they just thought, well, any system must be better than how this is working now. And so that just created so much more, I think, headwind for change. And I think in looking at some of the other referendums that have taken place in Canada, if people feel kind of happy with, or at least okay with, like, maybe how their government is performing at that moment in time, then they're less likely to go, oh, I need change. And ironically, when you look at 2005 in BC, when they did actually vote a majority to change, but it had the 60% threshold, so it didn't pass, you had a period where I think the NDP at the time won a majority despite not coming second in popular vote, then followed in 2001 by this kind of wipeout election where I think the BC Liberals won almost every seat. And so you had that very stark kind of results that made people go, oh, the system really isn't working right now. And then, of course, that led to the majority vote, but then it didn't pass. And so I think when you have those conditions, I think referendums can be very successful. But otherwise, I think that, we had a Royal Commission that recommended changing. They said change. They said we should do it. And at the end of the day, I think it makes sense. And you should just do it.
Anybody else like to jump in before we move on? Trisha?
Yeah, Trisha, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Ireland, we've had many, many, many referendums, mainly to do with the EU and various treaties and that. Now, what was done in Ireland and was done very well is that they had specific, they had lots of information, and they had even had a commission, and you couldn't, you had to be so careful about what was being said so that you didn't sort of help one side or the other. But they failed as well. The referendum I would like to bring to everybody's attention, first of all, I think they're too blunt an instrument, is Brexit. You've all heard of Brexit? Yeah, if you haven't. That was just sort of, David Cameron, just one day he thought, okay, I'm going to call a referendum because his right-wing backbenchers were pushing him. There was no preparation. It was just, as most right-wing parties do, they get bring back Britain or whatever it was, Farage, or the healthcare blah de blah. And so the people didn't really know what they were voting for, and they voted. And for a lot of them, there's buyer's remorse. What I found very upsetting was that people like the Irish who went to England in the 50s, England took them in, and when they had nothing. And a lot of those older people, they voted to Brexit. Other people who came to England as immigrants, and they all kept saying, oh, it's full. The country is full. We don't want any more. And the last point is that Wales got the most European money for different projects because they have very high unemployment. They were their area was the highest number of no voters. So as they say, be careful what you wish for. You could do a referendum, but it can go complete wrong way.
I think I hear what you're saying, Trisha. Referendums end up being on a vote, something that's not exactly what's on the ballot. Did you have a comment, Heino?
Yeah, my comment is that I think it's important, regardless of how you get there, and there are many ways to get there, that citizens, let's say it's federal here, that citizens across Canada feel like they had a say in the matter. And we can look at what we've done in the past here in Canada and learn from what's worked and what hasn't worked. I mean, there's the path of having the citizens assembly and then have them propose and then vote and then see if that matters. If that gets us somewhere, you could have the parties say in advance of an election, oh, we're going to have a citizens assembly, whatever they come up with, we'll do. And another path forward is the parties agree in advance of an election, saying, like, if we get elected, this is what we're going to go on. And I thought we had a good chance of that with Trudeau having an agreement with the NDP, because he had said very clearly when he first became prime minister that he wanted electoral reform. And NDP, at least when I meet the grassroots, they're a party that says they want electoral reform. So I really thought that was an opportunity to for the parties to get together and move things forward. I think the really interesting solution would be if there was a coalition of parties that could sit together before an election and agree on a system and then run on that, because if they do it that way, you can say that citizens have had an opportunity to weigh in on the matter. And I just think, regardless of how we get there, it's important that folks out across Canada feel like they had a say in the matter.
Yeah. I think, you know what Heino was saying, there's lots of different paths to legitimacy.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we need to look at the fact that usually the only ones calling for a referendum are the ones who are can't wait to campaign against it. Um, you know, because the research shows that referendums are extremely difficult to win, and the yes vote is likely to fall at least 20 points between 6 months out and voting day, based on things that have nothing to do with what's on the ballot and everything to do with what's being said, that is about partisanship. It's about misinformation. The age of social media isn't really going to help that. I think we all know what I'm talking about. Uh, so just to put, you know, to put it out there that while New Zealand got PR through a referendum, every other OECD country got it through a multi-party agreement. So the path to legitimacy is for parties to agree and to implement it. I want to turn it back to Chris now to
Yeah.
ask the next question.
Yeah, this was an interesting question that came in. What is your, in the respective places where you folks came from, the satisfaction with the voting system? In Canada, we have this amazing organization, Fair Vote Canada, advocating to change our electoral system. Would there be any such organization looking to change away from PR in those countries?
I can say very briefly, there is no movement for a switching the Danish system to first past the post system. No, doesn't exist.
I finally managed to convince my dad the other day that switching to MMP was a good idea. So there's definitely some people who, because New Zealand has had it comparatively less than the other countries here, that there are still some people who grumble a bit about it. But New Zealand there's no organized group to change back to first past the post. There was a referendum held in 2011, a follow-up referendum, and the majority chose to keep MMP. And there have been discussions, and if anything, the next round, if reforms do happen, it's going to be to make it even more proportional, because there's a lot of discussion about lowering the threshold and increasing the seats as well. So it's so it'll probably get more proportional, not less.
Ireland, as I mentioned, has had PR for close to 100 years. We previously, when we were under British rule, we had first past the post, and then there was a lot of toing and froing. There was actually a referendum done. I'm not sure exactly when, but it was quite a while ago, to see if the voters wanted to go back to first past the post. And it was no way. We are very happy with what we have.
Thanks, Trisha.
I might add another question. And I think here in Canada, when this is all we know, right? We use first past the post at every level of government. It's hard to imagine, okay, what does it look like? And I think the question here is, how is government actually formed? How are cabinet ministers selected? What do those negotiations look like? If you folks could provide some examples of that.
You're on mute, Trisha.
Oh, sorry.
You're on.
How the governments are formed, like in Ireland, is that what you're asking? Oh, okay. Well, first of all, once the votes are count, and then sometimes that can take weeks because it's there's sometimes there's recounts and that. What they do first is they look very simply who has the largest number of votes. So then they will be the main party. Now it doesn't always work out like that. So then they go to seek a coalition partner. Generally in Ireland it has been Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and then it used to be just Labour. They always used to say we had a 2.5 party system. Labour was the mud guard on the bicycle, but anyway, we had to have some humorous ways. So they approach the different parties. Some of them will say they don't want to go into government. For example, the smaller parties, they might say we don't want to go in this time. We can make better use of our time in the parliament by staying out. Let's say they decide, okay, this is a very interesting point that, as I mentioned, Sinn Féin, who were, they're the political side of the IRA. They're in the opposite. They should have had the opportunity to go in with the last government, but the two main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, are not very keen to go in with them, and that goes back to our Civil War politics, because they were at one point the enemy. But so then they approach the different parties, and then they sit down, as we say, they have what they call the horse trading, because the smaller parties say, well, we'll come in, but we want we want ministers, because there's no point in being in and not having a ministerial. And so they'll go, maybe we'll get health, can we have justice? And then the main party will say, no, we want this, we want that. Eventually then they do decide. And they sit down and they actually write what they're going to work. It's not like where I think, and I'm sort of straying into Canadian politics, the NDP and the Liberal Party this time, they had a kind of an agreement, but it fell apart. It could have fallen apart at any point. Whereas when they go into coalition, they say, okay, we're going to stay together for 3 years. We're going to stay together for 4 years. And then once it's done, and they'll say, like the smaller party say, okay, I want to focus on health. And the other party would say, well, we want to focus on finance and stuff. And that is all written into the coalition. And so if they say they'll stay, they sign up, we will stay together for 3 years. And they do that. Now, if by some chance the main party doesn't follow through with the small, well, we're going, but generally, and I think that's where the coalition in the PR system works really well. And it's not just a supplying confidence. Sorry, I'm going into the weeds. But anyway, I think they're brilliant if they're set up properly. And now the very last point I want to make, unfortunately, the smaller party always loses after they've been in coalition. I have no idea why. It has happened many, many times. But anyway, that's another day's discussion.
I just want to touch base on what Trisha was saying about just the different possibilities for government with proportional representation. In 2020, the two big parties decided to work together and take turns being prime minister. If you can kind of get your head around this in Canadian politics, it kind of would make your head sort of explode, right? Imagine Justin Trudeau going to Jagmeet Singh and saying, how about I'll be prime minister for 2 years and you can be prime minister for 2 years? Like, we're not at that level of cooperation in Canada. We're nowhere near that. They kind of had a sort of sort of agreement, like Trisha was saying. But there's different possibilities based on what people have in common, and sometimes based on who they don't want to be in the government as well. There's a lot of flexibility in proportional systems. Heino, did you have a lot of stability too? I think I just want to reinforce what Trisha's saying, that when these governments are written, these agreements are written, it's not like every 2 weeks, what are the polls at? Is the government going to fall? Who's going to pull a confidence vote? You don't see that in the media all the time. They write an agreement, it's a very long and detailed agreement, and then they work together and they mean it. So Heino.
Yeah, so I think the question was how is government formed and how are ministers appointed? And I'll do like a broad description based on recent history, but of course this is very dynamic, and at any point in history it's looked different. But so there are 179 seats in the Danish parliament. So if you can count to 90, you're in power. So typically, the Social Democrats have led the left of center coalition of parties. Recent history, Venstre, Danish Liberal Party, has led the right of center coalition. And if any of those coalition of parties can count to 90, it's the leader of either the Social Democrats or Venstre that gets together with the coalition parties and figure out how they can govern, because quite frankly these coalitions can the parties in the coalition, they can be quite different, so they typically sit down and figure out how can we find a way forward. Now the parties that are the more unruly folks in the coalition typically don't make it into government, so within that coalition of the 90 or 90 plus, you get a subset of that becomes the government. Now, once you have a government, you don't have to have 90 with you. You just can't have 90 against you on a vote, right? So that creates some stability there. But you do see, and you see that right now in Denmark, actually. So last time, the left coalition, then I might get the numbers wrong, but they got like 89. So they didn't get to the 90. And the right coalition, they got what was it, 85 or something. They didn't get to the 90. The reason why is that there are 4 North Atlantic votes, 2 from Greenland, 2 from the Faroe Islands, and they typically don't put themselves in any of the buckets in the when it comes to forming government. So you had the situation where no one had 90, but the left was the biggest. On top of that, you had war in Ukraine, which is pretty close to Denmark. You had an economy that looked like the near future was going to be tougher than it had been in the past. So what ended up happening, instead of there being a very narrow left of center government that relied on the far left party, the leader of the Social Democrats reached across the middle to get some of the bigger parties on the middle or just across the middle to form a coalition government across the middle and create some stability in that scenario where they just come out of COVID, economy was uncertain, and war in Ukraine. So that's how it's worked in recent history. I hope that satisfies whoever asked the question.
Emerson, did you have anything to comment on how governments are formed in New Zealand?
Uh, yeah, so governments seem to be formed pretty quickly after the election is held. I think the longest stretch was the first election in '96, when I think it was about 6 weeks it took to agree. And part of that was because New Zealand, like negotiating coalitions and thing, wasn't really a thing that had been done in New Zealand before that. So a lot of people on the negotiating table were, I think, kind of just, okay, how do we do this? Like, what do you offer? What do I offer? And things like that. But since then, government's been formed fairly quickly. A lot of the parties tend to advertise pretty clearly who they're willing to work with leading up to an election. So the Greens and Labour tend to work together. National and ACT on the right tend to work together, and then there are parties that are in the middle, like the Māori Party or New Zealand First, who are sort of open to working with anyone, as long as they could be willing to help for some of their agenda. And what that means is that there's really not much incentive to bring down a government when it's just going to rip up your own policy and ambitions, and when the most likely result is just going to be another minority government anyway, you might as well just make what you have work. So because of that, we do see very stable governments in New Zealand post MMP, and yeah, really no issues at this point.
Hey, it is 8:32, and I've kept everybody here already a couple minutes longer than I said I would. I want to thank our panelists Heino, Trisha, and Emerson for joining us. It's been great to talk to regular people. Usually we have webinars with like experts, and I wanted everybody to hear the perspective of people who've actually lived in these countries, how things work. Um, it's really not that scary. It's just more fair, inclusive, and representative. I'd like to encourage anybody who would like to get involved with Fair Vote Canada, please do. Right now, we are still visiting Liberal MPs. If you would like to lead a visit to your Liberal MP, we need leaders to join what Trisha is doing and trying to get a hold of the MP's office for an appointment. Expect it to take at least 3 months. But when you finally get in to have that conversation, it can be well worth the effort. So if you're willing to do that in your riding, please get in touch with me. I wanted to thank everybody for taking your time to join us tonight. And I wish everybody the best for the rest of your Sunday night.
Go Blue
Bye.
Jays. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.